How is everyone doing? Strength Chat episode 72, and today I've got a very special guest for you. I actually spoke to this guest last time in February for episode 53. Today I'm joined by a world record powerlifter, a coach, and owner of the Ludus Magnus gym. Today I am joined by Matt Wenning. How are you doing?
Good. How's it going?
I'm very, very well. How are you? What have you been up to, working on since we last spoke?
Just a lot of the same stuff, training the fire departments, went overseas and worked in Italy with a couple of the Army bases, and now working on a project with world-class powerlifter and bodybuilder Stan Efforting. We're going to come up with a video download on how to train smarter over 40 years old, which I think is a big niche in the market right now.
Yeah, obviously we chatted a little bit before the podcast actually started. I think that is a good area that, like you said before we started, an area that is often sometimes overlooked, or there's not enough content in that area.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you're starting to look over stuff, there's just not a lot of quality information out about how to train and how to look at your daily life cycle in order to kind of stunt the aging process and stay younger longer. And I think it's a very a subject that needs a lot more attention, because those are the type of people that already have their lives together. They already got a job. They already got family. They might already have a family that's halfway from being grown, like their kids aren't super young anymore, so they have the time to put back into training. And but there's just not a lot of information on what to do.
Yeah, I think sometimes, just on a little bit of a tangent on that topic, I think that's sometimes why people will drop off training, because they don't have enough information out there, or things that they can look at to help them get in or get back into training, like you say, if they have some more time free.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is we just want to have a product and a download that people can get quality information and research on, that they can train smarter and not get injured and enjoy life a little better.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Be looking forward to that. How's your own training going and all that sort of stuff?
It's good. I've been working really hard on the diet the last year and a half, so I'm still weighing around 120 kilos, but I'm down to about 11.9% body fat. And just been working on that, just working on a lot of the little small things that I ignored when I was just trying to compete world-class in powerlifting.
Yeah.
So just slowly cutting off as much bad weight as I can and maintaining all the muscle that it took me so long to build.
Yeah. Oh, nice. What are the biggest changes that you've seen in your diet and nutrition then?
I think it's just eating quality calories all the time. I think now it was kind of phasing. So like the first time I started it, back in, I don't know, what would be right before 2018 started, the first thing that I saw was the inflammation start to come off. And then what I started to notice was my energy levels started to kind of sustain themselves. And then I started to notice that my waistline started to drop down drastically, but my leg size and my shoulders and arm size and my back size stayed exactly the same as when I weighed 140 kilos.
Right.
So I kept the same measurements as far as the muscle mass was concerned, but my waist dropped nearly 7 inches.
Wow.
But the big things I did with most of my carbohydrates are rice-based. I eat a lot of rice for my carbs. The meat is fairly lean. The vegetable content's pretty straightforward. So it's just eating super clean. But what's funny now, and what I mean by cyclic, is that the first 3 months it wasn't that hard, and then the 3 months after that, it seemed like my body got to the point where it didn't want to eat what it was supposed to, because it was so similar all the time. We're used to having a variety of what we eat.
Yeah.
And then after I got over that last 3 month hump, within the last 8 months or so, my body's just conformed to it, and now it's kind of what I want in the morning. It's what I eat. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I suppose that helps with consistency as well, so you know that you're going to still be heading in the right direction. I know sometimes too much variety, and you don't know what actually works.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of nailing everything down, similar to training. You gotta take your eating habits as serious as you do your training, or you can't really gauge anything. It gets very difficult to nail down what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's the difference between your common bodybuilder and your common powerlifter, is that your common bodybuilder takes the nutrition just as serious as they do the lifting. And that's why they look a certain way and hold a good body fat and tend to have better blood values on things, because they're not eating anything dirty.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we last spoke, the podcast was on just YouTube and Spotify. Since we last spoke, I finally got the podcast up and running on iTunes. So
Nice.
A little bit more of a newer audience. So for everyone listening who might not have listened to the previous episode or might not know your background, do you just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself?
Yeah, sure. I started lifting at 12 and a half years old. So that was 1992. I did my first bench press meet at about the end of 93, and bench pressed like 120 kilos. And then as an eighth grader, and then caught the attention of some people at the local gym, which happened to be some really good national caliber lifters. And they kind of took me under their wing and taught me what they knew up till the point I was about 18 or 19. Then I ran into Louis Simmons at one of the Arnold Classics here in Columbus. And he invited me to come over to the gym and train there. And that's kind of where I started working on the higher level education level. And then that led me into school and college, where I achieved a master's degree in biomechanics from Dr. Kramer, which is one of the top strength researchers in the world.
Yeah.
Then once I did that, I turned pro in about 2004, and I squatted my first 900 pounds in 2004, and then squatted my first 1,000 pound in 2006, and then broke my first world record total in 2008 with a 1,085 squat and an 815 bench and about an 800 deadlift.
Wow.
And then in 2009, I was one of the first guys to squat 11, bench 800, and pull 800 in the same meet. And then 2011, I broke the world record in the squat by squatting 1,200 pounds. And then I switched over to completely raw in 2012 and bench 600, which at the time I think I was maybe the 18th guy to ever do it.
Yeah.
And then I was like only the fourth or fifth guy to do it under 300 pounds or 140 kilo. And then I did my first full raw competition with no sleeves or anything in 2013 and hit the third highest total of all time. And then at 14, I broke the world record in the squat with sleeves only, squatting right under 400 kilos, and then raised the squat world record again, and then hit the second highest total of all time at about 1,005 kilos, and then decided to retire in 2017.
What was the reasoning behind retiring? Was it just wanting to, put your efforts into something else, or what was the reasoning behind that?
Well, a lot of it was that with my frame structure, i.e. being 6'1", 6'1" tall, I had to weigh 300 to have the leverages to be able to lift that amount.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start putting health and aesthetics in front of powerlifting. I felt like I had done all I could do.
Yeah.
So by the time I was 37, 38, I was having to sleep, 10, 11 hours a day minimum, taking 1 and 2 hour naps, eating 6,500 calories a day. And then my training was locked in solid for about, 15 years. My body just was not capable of more.
Yeah.
I just couldn't, I would train really hard for a year and a half and my bench would go up 5 pounds.
Yeah.
I mean, and obviously it was going from 606 to 611 pound bench, which is still impressive. But you start realizing that, you're going to train for 10 miles long to gain 5 steps.
Yeah.
And for me, I was getting to the point where my gym was starting to grow and the contracts with the military and the fire departments were starting to grow. And it became a factor of not the gym time, but more so the time in preparation for the gym.
Yeah.
So what I started to realize was that the 10, 11 hours of sleep a day weren't going to cut it running a business where I had 3 other trainers and 3 fire departments and all these military contracts. It was really starting to cut into my my business. And I felt like it was time for me to help more people than just help myself.
Yeah, why I ask, and that's a great point great points that you made, and great reasons why. When you were mentioning the records that you'd broken, when you look at the other content that you've put out there, and from last time we spoke, the great thing about that is that the consistency that year on year you were able to build on it. And I think sometimes when you look at other powerlifters, they don't have that, like what you mentioned, focusing on health and aesthetics. They keep going and going, and I think that's sometimes where when it comes to the end of a powerlifting career, if you like, where a lot of people are beat up, but still following your content now, you're still training and still injury free, which is, I think that's, again, like what we mentioned about nutrition, trying to prevent injuries is an important factor that people have to take into account.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. There was no more benefit to me pushing harder. I'd already proved my point.
Yeah,
I'd already broke world records in equipment, world records raw. I'd already been top 3 or 5 in the world for 17 years. And then the risk to benefit ratio just wasn't there for me anymore. And I knew the only thing I could do was to get hurt. And my thought pattern was I'd rather train still pretty hard for the next 15 or 20 years versus sell out for the next 2 and then be beat up and injured and all this other stuff. I just started to get to the point where I knew I was maxed at my potential, and I wanted to learn more and help other people. And when I was competing at that level, even though I was still putting out decent amounts of content, as you can see now, within the last year, my content's really rose up a lot.
Yeah.
And the reason is because I have time now.
Yeah.
So for me, I knew that I could make a bigger impact helping others than I could just getting strong myself.
Yeah.
And I was at that point,
Yeah. Well, 100%. I know. Following the work that you're putting out and the videos that you're putting on YouTube and Instagram and everything. 100%. The content that you put out, massively helps me as a coach as well.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, obviously, when you started out in powerlifting and got invited over to Westside and got introduced to Louis Simmons. The method that was used is the conjugate method. Do you just want to chat about a little bit of, did you know about that training before you met Louis Simmons, or how did that actual training system come about?
Yeah, I'd already known about that system and had been playing with it. One of the big things that was an advantage for me is that Dr. William Kramer was at Ball State at the time where I got my undergraduate and graduate degrees, and he had been an adjacent or adjunct professor with Dr. Vladimir Zatsiorsky,
right,
which was actually in charge of all of sport for the Soviet Union for many, many years. And so I had access to those books as a teenager in my early 20s, so I was familiar with it. But what really changed when I went over to Louis' place was the ability to look at what type of intensity it was going to take to get to those numbers. So not only were we training way smarter than what I was doing beforehand, but the intensity level was like from another planet.
Right.
And, anybody that watches the new West Side versus the World documentary, it portrays a very close to accurate scenario of what it was like to be there at that time.
Yeah.
Very hardcore, very cutthroat, very intensive. So you combine that type of intensity with that type of training model, you're going to get some big ass numbers. Yeah. And that's what I was missing back home. And that's why I decided to move to Columbus, Ohio, was the fact that I needed to train with other people that had the same goals in mind.
Yeah.
And that's when my squats went from, I squatted close to 900 on my own. So I was already really strong, but I dialed all that in and, got it up to 1200, even back on my own when I left Westside, which was about 2008. So I was going over and training with Louis part-time from 99 to 05. And then I moved over there permanently from 05 to 08 and then started my own stuff in 09. But I really didn't get as strong as I ever got until I started to do my own system or my own version of conjugate, which was vastly different than what Louis did, even though the skeleton was similar.
Yeah.
But that's, if you read a lot of the high-level Soviet books, that's what they tell you, is the system is moldable. It's like fluid. So it's as powerful as your education level on what you need at that time.
Yeah.
So that's what I liked about the system.
Yeah.
But the real magic being at Westside, that I was already training that way, but then I saw the intensity it was going to take to make my numbers go farther.
Yeah. I think, when you're mentioning about intensity there, I think that's often a lot of powerlifters, will have, a garage gym or something like that. But when you're actually training, that phrase of surround yourself with like-minded people, if you're all pushing for that same goal to increase the weight, get stronger, it does push you, and increase that intensity. And, when you're mentioning there about, training a little bit smarter, that will help.
Oh, it's huge. So you got a combination of training like a maniac, but doing it smart. Yeah. And you're going to have some crazy lifts go down. And that was kind of what I learned from there, was what the intensity level was going to have to be.
Yeah.
And then, I transfer that a lot to my clients now. I think that my firemen and policemen and stuff like that actually come to the gym, they're introduced to an environment that is completely different than even when I go see them.
Yeah.
And I think that helps a ton. But yeah, I think the biggest thing I learned from Louis in the gym was just how to have that level of intensity, or what it was going to take to go to those numbers. Because you can read all the books in the world, and I tell this to strength coaches at conferences all the time. I'm like, if you're not making yourself stronger, then you don't really know if your system's any good.
Yeah.
You can read all the books in the world. You can study everything you want to study. You can go listen to anybody you want to listen to. But at the end of the day, if you can't make yourself stronger and better, then I'm not so sure your ability to make anyone else better as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, actually. So I run a powerlifting club on a Monday and a Thursday evening, and I had a new guy come last night, and he was asking me about what books. Obviously, I gave him some tips on. We were mainly doing squats on yesterday, and he was asking for what books he would recommend that he could read to help him get stronger. And I sort of, I did give him some recommendations, but the main thing is you've got to get into the gym. You've got to surround yourself with the other powerlifters that are in the club. You can only read so much. And how I told him is for my training, I get in and sort of practice what I preach. You can't. Yep. There is only so much that you can take from a book.
Yep, and that's the thing I think that's missing right now in our profession, is we have all these guys that want to make people stronger, but they're not willing to put their hands on the chop block and do it themselves for many years. And that's honestly, that's what separated me in this field from everybody else. There's quite a few people that have a master's degree in or some similar field that I have. There's quite a few people that have had, experiences and different internships, but the amount of experience that I have, both personally and those combined, makes it nearly impossible to be able to replicate because of the positions I put myself in.
Yeah. It is finding that balance. And like you mentioned there, you're a great example of balancing the education side of things with, the real world sort of training and coaching. You mentioned that you had access to the works from sort of what was sort of the Soviet Union, and obviously some of the books. I know Boris Shako has had one of his books translated. And when you mentioned about you went off and used one of the or changed or made it your own template for the conjugate method, how much information have you taken from from sort of the Soviet side of things? Because I know there is still a lot of work that hasn't been translated.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, the Soviets were so secretive even to their own people that a lot of Americans actually know more about what the Soviets were doing in the past than they do themselves, even though the translation is off. Because you got to remember that a lot of the professors and a lot of the researchers, a lot of the strength coaches that worked with those guys didn't stay in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union fell apart.
Yeah.
And they were secretive even to their own clubs. So guys like Verkhoshansky and Medvedev and, Zatsiorsky were already producing foreign literature when they left. So, when you had the guy that was in charge of all sport at Penn State for 30 years, those books and that research is going to come over with them.
Yeah. So
what you find is like the Soviets, as of right now, don't train nearly as smart as they did 50 years ago because they don't have the funding.
Right.
So if you look at programs such as Shiko, what I consider Shiko's programs is more Bulgarian system.
Right.
And the Bulgarian system was the old Soviet way of training, which is let's take 2,000 people, put them in a meat grinder, and find out the 5 people that pop out of it, and those will be the ones we train.
Yeah.
That if you look at Shiko's programs, they're not sustainable. They get a lot of injury, and they've only had a couple of big time guys that are not only hitting big numbers, but hit big numbers for a sustained period of time.
Yeah.
They're basically a shooting star type system, which would get you ready for one Olympic or one medal run or one thing of like that. And the Soviets discarded those types of training protocols probably in 1960 or so because they were too damaging to too many people, so they were losing too much money.
Yeah.
If you take 2,500 guys, you could make 500 of them Olympic hopefuls. That's a lot better than only getting 5 out of the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's what happens with the Bulgarian system, which is what I consider when I look at the Shiko system. That's what I see. Right. So that's what I mean. Is the problem is with the Soviet literature is that the Americans tend to have more of the literature now than the Soviets even can get their hands on, because they didn't, even though that stuff was product of the state, they were all from different schoolings and different backgrounds to where they were doing different things all across the country. And the Soviet Union is huge.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I guess my point is that I take it a ton from Zatsiorsky because of his education level and his experience level. He was in charge of all sport. So if you look at his knowledge base of how to train, it's vastly superior to everyone that came from the Soviet Union. Yeah. Because he had a more open thought pattern. Yeah. And that's where I think people need to realize is that higher levels of education and experience, say you just want to be a power lifter. Well, if you know a lot about sprinting and you know a lot about triple jumping and you know a lot about even swimming, for example, it may not directly give you education in powerlifting, but it's going to give you a broad base of information and knowledge. Because what you have to remember is that in those sports, they have put way more money and they have been around way longer than powerlifting. So their science base is going to be way higher. Yeah. So if you can not look at everything in a specific fashion and have an open mind, you can use sprinting style understandings with training. You can use swimming style understandings with training. You can blend a hybrid method of powerlifting that is not only more longevity based, but also much more long-term and injury preventative based, because those type of sports tend to have a lot more funding. Yeah. There's a lot more people that care about the 100-meter dash than the world record squat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Actually, I always think of it as using the analogy of building a base of a pyramid. You want that, like you say, you want that broad base of knowledge, and then you build up there to the specific point. Top of the pyramid which might be powerlifting. And when you mentioned there about being open-minded, there is still that portion of people, if you like, that stick with sort of the I don't know whether old school method is the right way, but are sort of stuck in their own ways and not willing to change. But like when you mentioned about the conjugate method being like a template and a little bit more fluid, so you can swap and change it. You can still have that base template, but be able to drop in and out and swap things around.
Yeah, and that's where I think you can really measure someone's education and persistence level, because when somebody trains conjugate, that means they have a very educated view of how they look at their body and how it reacts to training. And I think that scares a lot of people, because you have to be smarter to use a more complex system, because it allows too much variability. If variability is your enemy. So the point is like a lot of people like to gravitate towards specificity, because it's easier to understand and there's not as much thought behind it, even though I think it's an inferior way to train. It's just harder to think about. So when I see people getting confused on using this more complex system with more scientific understanding of, laws of accommodations and specificities, what you start realizing is really scary to them because it's out of their education level.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that phrase, isn't it? Is it off Batman where it's people are scared of what they don't understand?
Yeah, pretty much. And they're automatically going to refute something they don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? If somebody comes to you and starts talking to you about stuff that's far superior to what you do, a lot of people just block it out like they never even heard it, because to them, they go, well, you're telling me that I've wasted 5 or 6 years of training because I've been doing it wrong? They can't withstand that.
Yeah.
They felt like they've invested too much in one area or another. And that's what I like about my system, is that the way I think of things and how I learn, I would say that my skeleton of the conjugate system is hybrid and modified probably 5 to 10% per year of what I'm doing, because my body's already accommodated to the old skeleton. And now I'm adjusting to what my body either needs, both age-wise, recovery-wise, stress-wise, nutrition-wise. All of these things play a crucial role in how you can apply. It's not as simple as just writing something down and following it if you don't understand how your body's going to adjust to the programming. And that's where I think everybody, the first thing I tell people when they look at online coaching, which we do on the website and for fire departments and things like that, is it's a lot more than just knowing what equipment you have. You got to know how much time you have. You got to know what your stress level is. You got to know what your sleep cycles are.
Yeah.
You got to know what your nutrition looks like. You got to know what your age is. You got to know if you have any chronic or acute injuries. And then you got to know equipment. And now you can make a pretty good workout. But how many people do you know when they get an online coach or a personal trainer, none of those questions are being asked? It's just like, here's a 12-week workout. Hopefully it makes you better. See you later.
Yeah, that's why, when speaking with the people that I work with, it'll be on a weekly basis, right, what next week is looking like, right, well, actually, my sleep's not going to be very good because I'm going to be traveling around with work a lot. I think more people are changing it around, and these questions are getting asked a little bit more, but it just needs people to be made, or coaches to be made a little bit more aware of.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, is there is comfort in understanding that nobody can understand everything about the human body and how we're going to interact. But that, to most people, is stressful.
Yeah.
Like, they want concrete information, and in reality, there is no concrete information on how to train. That's where training has to be a blend of an art form and a science.
Yeah.
And I think people get so confused with it being a science that they forget that there's so much involved with it being an art form as well.
Yeah, it comes back to that point of, like what you mentioned, it is balancing that between the education and actually getting in the gym and being amongst it yourself.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't know how your workouts are going to stress you, there's no way you can see how it's going to stress others.
Yeah.
And the hardest part is that we're all a little different. We all have different genetics slightly. We all have different upbringings as far as what sports we played, what type of stress and stimuluses we've been adjusted to or lack thereof.
Yeah.
We have different ways that we've eaten as a kid and as a young adult that is going to change our insulin sensitivity and how we react to foods. All of these things are huge factors in being able to design, implement long-term a program that's going to get someone better. And I think the reason that it's so confusing is because most of the people that do programming, they're average people, meaning that it's easy to take an average person and make them stronger. But what you really have to do is look at what the top level guys are doing, because they can over and under train very easily.
Yeah.
So you take the tips and the guidelines and the precautions that an advanced lifter has, and you apply them to the intermediate and beginning lifter, because if it works for the best, it'll work for the worst.
Yeah, it is. Looking at what the better are, the best are doing. I mean, sometimes it is a case of people will pick a program off that the top level lifters are doing, and they might not be able to cope with that amount of work. But in terms of things that they're doing, in terms of technique, in terms of everything outside of the gym as well, they are there to be learnt from.
Yeah, and that's the trick, is you just have to keep an open mind and look at everything as a whole 360 degrees versus everything's so linear. Everything's more cyclic. Yeah. So you have to look at things as a whole picture and try to get a better blueprint of how to design something versus something straight ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned obviously that you've cycled through the conjugate method that you've used. How have you changed the method that you use over time, and how does that compare to when you were training at Westside with Louis Simmons?
The big difference is the warm-ups the warm-up protocols I use.
Right.
I'm a huge fan and fell on it by mistake, and I'll give you a quick example. The type of winning warm-up that I use, which if you guys are unfamiliar with what that is, you can go on my Winning Strength YouTube channel and look up the winning warm-up, and it can kind of show you. But what I started to realize was, as I told you, in 2012, I benched my first 600 raw. And it was a huge milestone, obviously, for anyone, but that's especially for me, because there was always this asterisk where if conjugate worked for raw lifters. And, that was a big debate back in the late 2000s, 2005 to, I'd say 2014. There was this transition from equipment to raw, and people were discrediting the conjugate system to be able to be used for raw. Right. And I was one of the first ones to break free and actually show massive numbers training conjugate style. So hitting that 600 raw and getting on the all-time 600 list was a big deal. Yeah. But when I did my first competition raw, which was squatting before benching, my bench fell to 574, and I couldn't figure out what the hell I was doing wrong, because the training showed everything was right to make a progression, but the squat had kicked my ass. And then what happened was, when I got to the bench, my energy level wasn't the same. Yeah. So instead of thinking as a meathead, well, I just need to be stronger, I started to have this thought premonition in my head that maybe I wasn't fit enough to be stronger. Yeah. So I started to add pre-fatiguing in upper body, and I would throw dumbbells in 4 sets of 25, and then push downs and lats. I figured my triceps and my lats were my weak point, which I was right. And I started to throw those in, and then the next raw meet I did, my bench jumped back up to 606 after squatting the world record, and I started to realize it was a conditioning problem. Right. And that's when I started to implement it into squatting, and then my squat jumped another 40 pounds, and then my deadlift jumped another 40 pounds. So what I started to figure out is that my body wasn't recovering from workouts, and when I go to meets, if I was trying to squat a world record, then my body was not allowing me to have enough energy to have that monster bench press.
Yeah, I find that quite interesting, because I kind of like the idea of it as problem solving, instead of exactly what you said. Oh well, I just need to get stronger. I just need to work on that. Instead of thinking, right, what are the weak areas? Why am I struggling? It's happened in the powerlifting club that I run. When it comes to so we have sessions on a Monday and a Thursday, and when it comes to testing, we'll have all 3 lifts. So it's a little bit like I make it into like an inter-club competition, if you like, but everyone's supporting each other. It's a bit more of a friendly environment, help everyone supporting each other and pushing, as opposed to I need to beat this guy. And it'll come round to the deadlifts or squatting to bench, and they'll be like, oh well, why am I so tired? And it's like, well, you've already done a squat, so there is going to be a little bit of fatigue left over for when you're going into bench, and then heading into the next block. That's what we can work on. So I've tried to think of it as that problem solving, because you don't know until you get thrown in that sort of situation.
Yeah, and you don't know until you try. I mean, I could have been wrong. Yeah. But I was willing to try something new. And I think the big thing is that sometimes when you try something new, it works just because it's different. And that pre-fatiguing, my body was not used to, it was not accommodated to. And when it started to learn how to do that, my work capacity went crazy. And I think that's the big thing with working with fire departments or military. As I started to realize that work capacity was a key ingredient to all forms of success with athletics. It wasn't just powerlifting. It had to transfer over to everything. So I started applying this warm-up to my fire departments, and their kettlebell swings and conditioning tests got better. Their muscle mass got better. Their injury rate started to decrease because, at 4 sets of 25, you're talking a lot of ligament and tendon density just based on volume. Yeah. So that's where I started to realize that I was onto something, not only to make myself bench 600 after a world record squat, but it was starting to help every form of population I was working with. But I would have never fell upon that if I wasn't training myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things I'll try out on myself, and with the coach that I work with, and then if that works, then I'll give it to the powerlifting club. I'm not saying it'll work for everyone. Again, going back to that problem solving analogy, what might work for one person might not work for the other. But like you say, if you don't try, you're not gonna know.
Yeah, I have found that winning warm-up works for everyone if you start at the right parameter in which your body is capable of recovering from. What I find is if people apply it, they might bench 100 kilos and their dumbbell weights are way too heavy. Yeah. So they're not accommodated recovering. So I started off with, 20 kilo or less kettle or dumbbells to bench press with that. And I was a 600-pound bencher, and then worked my way up to 50 kilo dumbbells for 25s. Yeah. But that was a 5-year process.
Yeah.
So it's all about where you start and what that you need at that time. Yeah. And that's the problem but I don't think anybody can ever go wrong with increasing work capacity. The only time I see work capacity not work is when it's overdone.
Yeah. Yeah, if it is done too much, you've basically you've wiped yourself out before you're training. But then on the flip side of that, sometimes you would have to make that mistake to realize, right, okay, I went a little bit too much on there. You mentioned about how sometimes people can go wrong with building up their work capacity. When it comes to using the conjugate method, because going back to the point that I said about people look online and look at programs and look what people are doing, where can sometimes people go wrong when they use the conjugate method, and is it suitable for everyone, or what would you recommend?
Yeah, it's a different scenario for everyone, but in general, I think the big mistakes I see is that on max effort day, they don't take enough jumps to get to the max effort set. So, for beginners, you're going to want to take 6 to 8, possibly even 9 to 10 sets to reach maximum. And for advanced lifters, it might only take 5 to 7. Yeah. But what I find is that when somebody says max effort, they think, well, I just have to start really heavy. That's not the case. You're working up to something heavy. The other big thing I see is they see max effort as doing singles or max effort 1 repetitions all the time. And in reality, they need to be a lot of 5s, because for most people, they don't have the muscle mass to be as strong as they want to be. And 5s is a delicate blend of strength and muscle hypertrophy, because it's a little bit more volume.
Yeah.
So what I think is that, they tend to use the wrong rep ranges for too often. And then the other big thing is that because their education of exercise variety is so low, i.e., they don't know you can do tricep pushdowns 100 different ways. They tend to do it the same way too often, therefore falling in the same problem as law of accommodation, which means the body's going to recognize the stimulus, and then therefore the stimulus becomes less and less effective.
Yeah.
So what you find is that they tend to use the same modes too much. Like, people call me all the time or message me, hey, Matt, I'd like to use conjugate system, but I only have a straight bar and a squat rack. And I'm like, okay, well, you're kind of limited to what you're going to be able to do.
Yeah.
You're going to have different kinds of bars, different kinds of resistances and bands and chains. But I think you find that people sometimes want to train smarter, but they don't want to invest in doing so. And furthermore, training with variety is still not a huge thing in anywhere in the world. So what ends up happening is that people can't find the facilities that accommodate them being able to train in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
So that's what I find is the big issues with using conjugate to the normal person. But in a perfect world with the perfect setup, conjugate will work for almost any goal as long as you know where your weaknesses are.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, done properly, you know, things and programs will work. But, you know, it's a good point that you're making there about people want to train smarter, but don't always want to, you know, put the effort in or go seek out gyms that, you know, they can help them get better. And, you know, that's sometimes where people won't make progress and won't get stronger. You know, if they're coming in and doing the same thing, what's that? I think I mentioned this when we last spoke before, but definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Sometimes you've got to go out there and find those gyms, find the other pieces of equipment that you can, you know, use a different training type.
Oh yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's the whole thing, man, is it's gotta be a full-time investment to figure out not only to educate yourself, but to also put yourself around the right modalities in order to make progress, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. So you just touching back on the work capacity side of things, and you mentioned that you used the pre-fatigue method for your bench press. Just obviously from a work capacity point of view, but also as I know a lot of things get or sort of pre-lift primers, if you like, get thrown about as well. Looking at the squat and the deadlift as well as the bench that you mentioned, what are the purpose, as well as work capacity, what are the other purposes of adding in those different variables before you start lifting?
Yeah, so the point of that is to potentiate or turn on the weaker muscle groups. So like if I think my arms need to be kind of primed before I bench press, well, if I do that 100 times, every time before I bench press for 6 months, my arms probably aren't going to be the weak spot anymore.
Yeah.
At least neurologically. And what I also find is that it warms up the ligaments and tendons, so it reduces injury. But then the other big thing that I noticed it does is that if you pick the right exercises, i.e. if I'm going to squat, then I'm going to belt squat 4 sets of 25 to reinforce my knees being pushed out, my hips going back, i.e. perfection of form. So when you're priming a movement, if you're on a squat, you need to do a squatting movement to prime the squat.
Yeah.
Or potentiate the proper motor pattern. And that's where I think people screw up, is that, you know, their squatting potentiation is their lighter sets. But, you know, when I was squatting close to over 400 kilos and just knee wraps, I was doing warm-ups for 4 sets of 25 with 220 kilos for sets of 25. So my knees and my hips and everything were so dense from doing all that volume. And, you know, I never even pulled a muscle. I think a lot of that had to do with my low injury rate.
Yeah.
And same thing applies with all my fire departments and all that stuff, is that they're always primed to do a hard movement. So it's never a big surprise to them, because if you've already squatted 100 times, when you get under the bar and squat, you've already been there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that familiarity of that movement allots a lot of safety precaution with also increasing muscle mass, ligament, and tendon density.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's killing two birds with one stone there, because I think, you know, like what you mentioned about where people sometimes go wrong is, you know, they'll either, like what you mentioned about the work capacity, they'll make it too heavy, or like one of the other points that you mentioned, people might not 100% understand what those pre-lift, you know, primers are for, so they'll try and stay away from them. Whereas actually, there's a lot more benefit and reward to actually adding them in.
Oh, and that's exactly right. I mean, that's the thing, is I think people, if I were to go back again and say they warm up too heavy and they don't know the muscle groups in which they need to prime, those are the two reasons why the Wenning warm-up would not work as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned there about using a belt squat before you actually squat as well, and then touching back on the point of where if people are unsure or don't have access to other equipment, what are your sort of go-tos for people that you've worked with in gyms that might not have a belt squat? For example, the primers for the bench press, squat, and deadlift. Do you have any go-tos that you would recommend people to use?
Well, it depends. Like, the hard part is some of that stuff's just not replaceable.
Yeah.
But like the belt squat gets hard. You can replace it with a standard dip belt and weights hanging from your waist if you're not very strong.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to do that with 250, 300 pounds. Get in and out of it. It's kind of not really user friendly.
Yeah.
But it's definitely doable, and it's better than doing nothing. But at the end of the day, it's going to become needing the proper equipment to do so. But, the belt squat or a variation of it is going to be a huge thing. But even if you can't do the core movements with the specialized equipment, still warming up the muscle groups in which you find are your weakest links, which is usually either going to be for the lower body, glute activation, hamstrings, or low back.
Yeah.
Those are going to be your three major areas that are going to limit your lifting potential dramatically. And then in the upper body is going to be doing a tricep dominant movement, some kind of a scapular postural movement, a lat pull down, a row, and then either rotator cuffs or an actual pressing movement in and of itself with proper form.
Yeah.
Which the upper body is a lot easier to kind of make malleable in a normal situation. The legs take a little bit more thought because, the big thing I think we've talked about in the last podcast, especially if you're looking at mileage to benefit ratio, is that you need to have equipment that is traction based and not compression based.
Yeah.
Whereas the upper body doesn't really matter, but the legs, you got to be careful with how much mileage you put on your spine.
Yeah. Yeah, that quote from the last time we spoke, I must admit that has been stuck in my head ever since we spoke. And it's funny when you mentioned about you can have a dipping belt around your waist and sort of replicate a belt squat. I actually tried that, but then it gets to a point where you try and put a little bit more weight on, and it just becomes too much of a hassle to try and do it. So. I have been in a couple of meetings. I have been mentioning about. I think it might be beneficial if we get a belt squat. And then I try to drop in there about the reverse hyperextension that you have as well. So I'm still working on it.
Yeah, it takes time. It takes time for sure.
Yeah. Obviously mentioned there about the pre-lift primers, and mentioned about where people go wrong in the max effort side of the conjugate method. One area that again, a little bit like the pre-lift primers, that people sometimes don't understand, and that's why they don't use it. The area that I find people that sometimes don't understand, or there isn't necessarily, or people don't know about the information out there for it, is the dynamic effort and lifting with speed, basically. So do you just want to give a little bit of your thoughts on and what the science says behind the actual benefits of the dynamic effort and lifting with speed?
Yeah, it's just increasing force production on the other side of the spectrum. So what the Soviets figured out was that you can't strain really, really hard every 3 days, but you can put the same amount of force into something if it's at a higher velocity.
Mm-hmm.
So what they would do is they would have a day where they would work on maximal strength, which is straining ability, and then another day where they had peak force production, which was more accelerative. So what you find is that it was a way that the Russians figured out how to increase high amounts of force without having to go heavy all the time.
Yeah.
So it's just a way to go harder in a different way is pretty much the trick. But what you find people mess up on is that they don't treat speed day like real speed. It should almost be as fast as a plyometric or over 1 meter per second, which you find most people, if they're using the dynamic day, they tend to go too heavy.
Yeah.
And a great video to state that point is on YouTube. We literally just posted a speed bench video on how fast it should look. So if your speed squats, deadlifts, and bench presses don't look to that caliber, then it means that your weight is too heavy.
Yeah.
But what you find also is that you can't really start the dynamic method until your form is impeccable.
Yeah.
You can't you can't do something fast if you can't do it normal. And that's where you find that you have to create a base motor pattern of perfection before speed work can be used as optimal.
Yeah, I think that's where, a key thing that I know it's been, instilled in me throughout my training is that technique and good form overrides everything. If you don't have good technique, one, you're going to be at a higher risk of injuring yourself. And when it comes to using methods like this, you're not going to get the benefit from it.
Exactly. And that's where I think people need to realize is that, you got to have impeccable form, because once you increase velocity or force, then the ability for you to get worse or your form to degrade faster is extremely accelerated.
Yeah.
So if you don't have good form, moving everything perfect at a medium speed or an average speed, then there's no way it's going to look right. It's fast.
Yeah.
But there's one other thing that can be involved with that, and that's speed work can also be a valuable coaching tool if the right person's standing around. So, for example, I've never seen you bench press, but let's take the fact that I don't want you to go heavy to see where you're having problems. You can use the dynamic method as an assessment tool. So if I tell you to get under, say, 50 kilos and you're a 100-kilo bencher, which isn't a heavy weight, and I'd say move that as fast as you can, guess what? You're going to make the same mistakes under high speed that you are under high stress.
Yeah.
So if you move something quickly, you're going to make the same problem or the same issue as you do when something's heavy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that phrase of lift your light weights like they're the heavy weights. If something's highlighted at lighter weights and you're moving it fast or moving it using light weights in the warm up, those things are going to be highlighted.
Exactly.
So you mentioned there about people either go too heavy and don't move it as fast. What have you found to be the best variables the best percentages of weights that and rep ranges that you found to work well?
Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. My percentages are slightly a bit less than what Louis' guys talk about, but I like to fire in between the 30 and 40% range.
Mm-hmm.
I find that increases max speed strength, and it also magnifies the ability for max effort training to be accelerated or better. So what I found is that if I train in the 50-60% range, that it starts to affect the max effort training. And if I train in the 30-40% range, it actually enhances max effort training.
Right.
I think it's because the percentages are far enough separated that it's a new stimulus to the body.
Yeah. And
it's not as much damage. So what you got to remember is that when you get heavily educated and heavily seasoned, your ability to get damage on speed work is just as high as heavy.
Yeah.
Because you're actually able to create a high amount of force production.
Yeah. But
the average person, they're not going to be able to fire that fast. So training has to get smarter as you get better because you're more skilled.
Yeah. That's really interesting because, when you mentioned there about using the different percentages and how that might affect the max efforts, the next max effort session, that comes down to getting smarter with your programming as well. I think sometimes, again, another area that's overlooked is how sessions can have an effect on other sessions and being a little bit smarter about that.
Well, that's the key, is that you want everything to build on itself, not tear itself down.
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem is that you got to look at training as like building a brick wall where you're laying down one brick at a time.
Yeah. And
you're building up the wall. But what I find with most people is they're coming in to train and taking a wrecking ball and knocking half the wall down.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned there about how doing the dynamic effort properly can increase the force production as much as instead of doing a max effort day all the time. Have you found that dynamic efforts and training with speed has more benefit on certain lifts than others, or is it successful across the board?
I think it's pretty successful across the board. I think that it depends on the goal, obviously.
Yeah.
For me, I would like to see all of my firemen be able to deadlift 365 in speed. I would be able to see them pull, say, 600.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, them being able to move a 350-pound person quickly, effectively, and explosively with perfect form is much more usable in their given day than being able to grind out a 600-pound deadlift.
Yeah.
So it depends on the end goal. Now, if you're a powerlifter, obviously you want the ladder, but it doesn't mean that doesn't help. So what I find is that you got to look at everything in a holistic approach and figure out what's the real goal here and how am I enhancing that position without ignoring any key variables. Yeah.
So just on that note, then, say for example, let's stick with the powerlifters. You'd use the speed on the main lifts. What are your thoughts on using sort of explosive lifts, like for example, just keep sticking with the example of the bench press, like an explosive med ball throw against the wall, and using that as a pre-lift primer as well? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think that's bad, but the only problem with using a med ball is the fact that you're not going to be able, if somebody's moderately strong, you're not going to be able to get one heavy enough.
Yeah.
But as an athlete, if I were say an MMA fighter, then that might have a little bit more variability and transferability to fighting than actually bench pressing with a bar. But it would still be a good variable you could throw in occasionally. I just think it depends. At that point, it depends on the specific goal in mind and how athletic, away from powerlifting that person needs to be as far as their sport's concerned.
Yeah.
So you have to look at all those variables and say, okay, well, this person is an MMA fighter and this person only throws their fist. They don't throw weight. So the med ball might be a little bit closer to explosiveness than speed strength, which could be a better variable at the end of the day for that particular athlete if they're already pretty good at doing the classical lifts.
Yeah.
So what I have found with like fighters is you can take a med ball and they can throw it like powerful, but you give them 35% on a straight bar and they can't move it quickly. So you already know where their weaknesses is, so you train their weakness.
Yeah. Yeah, what I asked is that, wanted to pick your brains on it is that, you'll see powerlifters put their warm-ups out and be like, oh, I use this, I use that. And you'll see some people come in and try and replicate it. But, like what you mentioned, they might not have the good movement to be able to do it. They might not be able to, when it actually comes to using the barbell lifts, if they do move something fast, like using the bench press that we've used as an example, the weaknesses might be highlighted on that. So yeah, I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that, and I agree. You've got to look at what the everything else that's happening in the background to see whether they can actually perform that.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, look at the goal and look where the weaknesses are. The weaknesses are always going to be the fastest way to make better gains. So if you're weak and explosive, then you're going to have to be careful to use explosiveness. You already have it.
Yeah.
But if you're strong and you're slow, then explosive training is going to be a little bit more pertinent to you because you're going to balance out the weak point.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things where you're always playing catch up. It's always a cat and mouse game.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why as a coach myself, I find all this really interesting because again, it is problem solving. There is always something to look at, work on, and improve.
Exactly.
Quite a lot of topics covered there. I really enjoyed the first time that I spoke to you, and a lot of things that you said in the first podcast that we spoke have stuck with me. I've taken a lot from this podcast as well. For all the topics that we've covered there, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom for everyone listening?
I think it's just making sure you know what you need instead of what you want, and that's the hardest part of understanding training is that you got to know what your needs are and be able to adjust your training based on your needs. And that's why in the smart man's hands, the conjugate system is second to none because it allows enough variability for the smart man to adjust for his needs. So it's not as simplistic as just writing something down and doing it, but in the long run, it's much more beneficial for you, because at the end of the day, your weaknesses is the fastest way to get better and the easiest way to avoid injury.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, completely agree. I think people often sometimes, overlook working on their weaknesses, because it is hard, and it is problem solving that you need to like we've mentioned throughout. It is about training smarter. Thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with Matt. Really, really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else listening enjoyed that as much as I did. For everyone listening who might want to follow the content that you put out there, obviously you mentioned about the online coaching, and if they want to get involved in some online coaching with you, where can people find you?
Well, the easiest way is, on Instagram. So my tag is at real Matt Wenning. And then obviously we have the website, wenningstrength.com. And we're all over the place, and we're in Columbus, Ohio, but we do a lot of stuff through the website. So if you make it through the website, the YouTube channel is also Wenning Strength, and we're putting out loads of content, and we're actually going to put out a very detailed monthly paid channel here very soon.
Oh, cool.
That will have tons of exercise library, a lot of the conjugate stuff that we use, sample programs, and then also working on this DVD with Stan about aging and training smarter. But yeah, I mean, the website, the YouTube channel, and the Instagram is where you're going to find a lot of information that you can sit through and check out and see.
Cool. Just on there, an online platform paid, did you say, so you can see a little bit more of the work that you do?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I'll be 100% looking out for that.
Yeah, the YouTube channel right now, we're already putting out tons of information, but we're going to start going more in depth on the topics.
Yeah.
And then just creating a page that will be a small monthly due, and it'll just cover basically editing costs. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Cool. 100%. I'd look out for that. Everyone listening, the content that Matt puts on his Instagram and the YouTube channel as well. The content that's being put out there for free is well worth it. And yeah, whenever the other page is up and running, I'd 100% recommend that as well. Thanks a lot to everyone listening. Thanks again, Matt, for taking the time to chat with me, and I will see you all next week.